So I'm Billy Thomas. I'm an extension forester here in the Department of Forestry at UK. I've been in my current position about 10 years. I have an undergrad and a master's in forestry from the Department of Forestry. So I've done all my training here in Kentucky, and I wouldn't have it any other way. I certainly love it. I'm originally from Bell County, Middlesboro, and just glad to be with you all tonight. This subject on tree identification is very fascinating and very interesting to me, and hopefully you all as well. We have a great deal of diversity of tree species here in Kentucky, and really Kentucky has some of the most diverse forests of anywhere in North America. There's only very few places that have more different species of trees than Kentucky. So it makes it a lot of fun to try to do tree identification, but it also can make it quite challenging. So we're going to try to remove some of those mysteries of how you can go about identifying the trees, and I think I hope you'll feel better about the process of it. It just takes some practice, and we're going to give you a chance to practice some of that tonight. Before I do get jumping into it, though, again, want to thank the county extension offices for serving as hosts. We really appreciate them opening up their offices and being a host for this webinar, so thanks to each of them. And as to each of you all viewing from home, if you didn't have a county extension office nearby, thanks so much for taking the time to come and be part of this presentation. We're delighted to have you. So we'll get rolling with it. We should last about an hour, give or take a few minutes. First, I want to talk about kind of what I'm going to cover in the presentation tonight. First thing, I'm going to talk about some of the different approaches to tree identification. We're going to focus primarily on the leaf-on approach. That's one of the easier ways to get a handle on identifying your trees, but there's certainly many other ways, and I'll briefly talk about some of those. We'll spend a bit of time talking about leaf characteristics, because that's going to be the way we're going to be able to tell which one tree from another, or the unique characteristics that each individual tree has. And as you'll see, there are a number of different characteristics on every leaf that we can use to help identify it. The next thing we're going to talk about is how to use a dichotomous key. A dichotomous key is a simple tool that we can use to help narrow down which tree we're looking at. And after we go over what a dichotomous key is and give you an example of it, we'll have the time to practice a few of those. I've got a few species that we're going to try to identify together at the end of the night. I hope you'll work through those with me. And there will be a little bit of quizzes to see if you're paying attention at the end as well. So we hope you'll do that. And finally, I'll wrap up with some of the tree ID resources that are available. Certainly, the internet brings a lot of stuff to your fingertips, but probably one of your best tree ID resources is your local county extension office. They have the ability to probably identify many trees, and if they don't, they have the ability to get a hold of us here at the University of Kentucky, and we can help them in that. So that's going to be one of your best resources, is to work with your local county extension office. So let's talk for a moment about Kentucky's native trees. The image there on the screen is of Robinson Forest down in Breathitt County, Kentucky. It's a beautiful area, tremendous amount of diversity of tree species. And I don't know if it's got 120 different native tree species, but it sure has a lot down there, that's for sure. Here in Kentucky, according to the Kentucky State Nature Preserves Commission, there's well over 120 different native tree species here in the state. Depends on how you classify a tree, whether that number is a little bigger or lower. Typically, a tree needs to be a single stem and at least 13 feet tall. Point being, there are a lot of different trees out there. So when you have that many different species, it can be really challenging to know one from another. So we're going to try to help you work through that. But with that diversity of over 100 tree species, there are some groups that we have a lot well represented. One is our oaks. We have 20 different species of oaks in Kentucky, and while they all have acorns, they all have unique differences as well. Some are certainly more important from a timber standpoint than others. Some are more important from a wildlife standpoint. So we'll talk about those a little bit too. We also have 13 different hawthorns. A hawthorn's a smaller tree, but certainly got a lot of diversity out there in Kentucky with those hawthorn species. Really important for wildlife as well. We have 10 different hickories out there, and a pecan is in the hickory group. So there's a lot of different ones out there of those as well. 8 different maple species, and believe it or not, box elder is a type of maple. And believe it or not, you can make maple syrup out of any of those maples out there. The key difference is that sugar maple, the one we're most familiar with for maple syrup, has the highest sugar concentration. So it's a little bit easier to make maple syrup out of it. We also have 5 different species of elms. So just right there on the screen, you've got over 50 species there of different trees that are similar, but certainly they are unique. And we'll talk about what separates one tree from another here in a moment. Before we get into that, let's talk about names. Now, growing up in Kentucky, I've run across a lot of different common names or local names for tree species. You all may recognize this leaf here on the page. That's the state tree of Kentucky. It's no longer the Kentucky coffee tree, which is the state heritage tree. This is the yellow poplar, which is the state tree. But some of the common names I've heard for this include tulip tree, tulip poplar, and there's others. And if you all know of any other names for yellow poplar, put them in the chat pod. I'd really be curious to see what other names you all have heard for this species. It does have an official common name, though, and that official common name is yellow-poplar. We don't say the hyphen, but it does belong in there. And it has that hyphen in there because it's not really a true poplar from a taxonomic standpoint. So each tree species in the world that we've identified so far has an official common name. And the official common name for this species is the yellow poplar. But to understand one another around the world when we're talking about the same tree, trees have been given scientific names, and these scientific names are in Latin. And the reason that they're in Latin is because Latin is considered a dead language. It doesn't change, so the ideal is that these names will persist over time. So when we say Liliodendron tulipifera, everybody that knows that as yellow poplar will know what we're talking about. So we can be anywhere in the world and we can say that, and everybody knows which tree we're talking about. Now, I'm not going to quiz you on knowing all the Latin names for all these species, but I think it's important that you understand how trees are classified and that there is a logical sequence that's gone about ordering our trees. So let's talk a little bit about that classification system. This nice graphic coming up from the Arbor Day Foundation, and I gave you the link to it up there you can use. They've got a great website as well on identifying some of the trees, and we'll talk a little more about that later. But here is the grouping of the trees. I'm trying to pull up my little clicker here to show you. At this level, we're starting at the family level. This means we've got a wide group of trees that are all in the same family. For instance, the black walnut and the hickories are all in the same family. But in this instance, we're talking about Acer ACE. And really what that is the maple family. So we got a number of different maples here in Kentucky as well. The next level down as far as organizing the trees is the genus. And for there, then we're stopping down and we're getting down to Acer. So Acer is the genus name for the maples. And what this is these trees are closely related on a number of fronts, but there are a couple of characteristics that separate one from another. The next order down is species. Now at the species level, these trees can breed with one another and reproduce the same offspring. Certainly trees in the same genus can breed with one another, but they will have a different offspring. It'll be a hybrid of some type. But if we have 2 red maples breeding together, then we can have another red maple that will come from that. And that's where the species name is rubrum here. So that is the way we write it. So the genus is Acer, and the species name is rubrum. And that is the way that you'll see the scientific name written always. The Acer, or the genus name, will always be capitalized, and the species name will always be lowercase. And you'll see it in italics normally or underline. So when you're seeing that, what you're seeing is the scientific name. So that's a good way to clue you in on what you're looking at. And there's also kind of another lower level classification of variety. And a variety is it would be a type of the same tree. In this case, we got the Drummond red maple, and it's really similar to all the other red maples, except for it has a few characteristics that make it a little bit unique. It has a much hairier underside to its leaf. So those things, if we have 2 of those species together, then they will reproduce as well. So again, I don't want you to feel like you have to remember all of that, but I think it's important that we understand how trees are organized and cataloged, because it'll make the learning process easier. So let's talk about some of these other characteristics we can use to identify trees. One that's really good and useful, if you can get used to it, is the bark. A great thing about the bark is it's around all the time. So even if the leaves are off the tree, you've got the bark to draw on and to learn the trees. I will tell you it can be quite challenging, and there is a bit of variability in bark, but over time, if you spend enough time in the woods, you will start to get a feel just by bark alone. And many of our foresters that work out in the woods on a daily basis, they never have to look up to see what the species of tree is. They can tell just from the bark alone. And that can really speed things up as far as trying to get trees identified. Another attribute that we sometimes draw upon are the twigs and buds, and we'll talk a little more about those, but these are available most of the time year round. The buds at different times of the year are available, and they can be a great clue to identifying the tree. And I think we'll have enough time, or at least I hope we will. At the very end, I've put in one kind of bonus tree that we're going to ID, and we're going to try to ID it just by twigs and buds. So I wanted to give you a feel for the approach of identifying a tree without its leaves as well. And another you may not think much of, but flowers. Certainly trees are, our trees here in Kentucky, almost all of them are angiosperms, which means they're a flowering plant. And some of the flowers can be quite spectacular. They can be, they're very distinctive, and they're really a good clue as to what species we're dealing with. Another one is fruit. We mentioned acorns before, but all trees have some type of fruit on them that we can use. Some are a little more prominent than others. Another attribute you may not think about is location. We know that certain trees are successful in certain areas, so if we know where we're at in the landscape, that can be a good clue as to what species we're dealing with. So it's a problem if it's a planted tree, but if it's a native occurring tree, and that's really what the focus of tonight's webinar is on, the native trees here in Kentucky, then its location, it can be a good clue as to what we're dealing with. And then the one we're going to spend the most time on and we're going to practice quite a bit with is the leaves. The leaves are nice. They're an easy way. They're usually quite accessible, and they can be very easy to use as far as getting a tree identification. And we're going to work through a few practices on that. But before we get into the leaves, let's talk about some of the other ones I mentioned there. This one here I'm looking at on the far left is the black cherry. Many of you all have probably seen this. This is in the Rosaceae family, so you'll probably notice it kind of looks similar to peaches and some of our other species out there that are in that same family. But it's got that shiny silvery bark, and it will have these horizontal little lenticels in the bark that are a good clue. So again, just wanted to point out that there's other characteristics than leaves. And then in the center here we have the yellow poplar, again the state tree of Kentucky. One of its strong characteristics on its bark is these nice vertical white stripes, if you'll see, coming up and down the tree. And they grow in between the crevices of the bark, and they're a good clue to what that species is as well. Also, yellow poplar is commonly found in groups, and it'll be numerous trees, and it's typically a very straight tree, and it can get quite tall. And then over here, one of the more important trees from both a wildlife and a timber standpoint, and certainly from our distillery business, all of our bourbon makers out there really rely on this species, white oak. White oak is the wood that's used to make the barrels that are used to make bourbon here in Kentucky. So there's quite a bit of variability within this species on its bark, but at this size they start to have some similar characteristics. So again, just wanted to show you that there's other ways than just the leaves that we can use. So here, looking at some tree twigs and buds, on the far left here we have the Ohio buckeye. This has a really prominent terminal bud. This terminal bud is the bud at the end of the twig that we're looking at here. It's quite large, and it's a good clue as to what species we're dealing with. And then on the side we have these little lateral buds that are also a good clue. And again, each of these trees will have distinctive buds that we can use to identify them. In the middle of the screen we have the northern red oak. And one thing I hope you'll start looking at, and we'll spend more time on, is the arrangements of these buds. One thing that we use very often is the arrangement of the buds to tell the tree. So here's a little bud on the northern red oak, lateral bud, and here's another one down here. And then we've got this little cluster of terminal buds at the end of the twig. And then over here on the far right is a species that is really of grave concern for many of us. This is the white ash. And again, we have a number of different ash species here in Kentucky, but unfortunately, every single one of them is vulnerable to the emerald ash borer. And that emerald ash borer is making its way across Kentucky, and it's a real concern. And if you live in northern Kentucky or north central Kentucky, you're already experiencing this. And if you're near in other parts of the state, unfortunately, you probably will have to as well. I will say, just as a quick aside, there are some chemical treatments that we can do to protect the ash trees. It does require a repeated treatment every so often, every year or so, depending on the size of the tree. But it's not something that we can really afford to do on a landscape level. So if you've got some ash trees in your yard or wherever that are important to you, and they're not already too far gone, then check out the website. We have some information about different treatments that you can use, or feel free to give us a call later and we'll be happy to talk to you. Your county extension agent should also be able to help you with that information. All right, next let's talk for a moment just about tree flowers. Sometimes the tree flowers are quite showy and other times not so much. The one on the far left is a bur oak flower. It's kind of a whole cluster of different flowers there. And then one that's really distinctive here is the yellow poplar. Again, a beautiful green and yellow, a little bit of orange in there. It's a really large flower. You've probably seen it before. Sometimes you'll see them on the ground below the trees, but it's a beautiful flower. An easy thing to, once you see that, you know what you're dealing with, because there's nothing else that looks like it here in Kentucky. And then on the far right here, we have the flowering dogwood. Now, many of us probably have these in our yard. I know I've got a couple of these in my yard. It's a beautiful tree. You may see some that have the pinkish flowers. Those are another kind of variety of dogwood, but most of what you'll see here in the woods, or at least natively occurring, will have these white flowers. So again, just different characteristics that we can use to identify these trees. Another one that we may not think of always is the fruit. This fruit here is the sassafras fruit. It's an important fruit for a lot of animals. It's small little drupe-like fruit. In the middle here we have the American beech. It looks a little gnarly there with the little spikes on the edge, but inside are little beech nuts that are really, really important for wildlife. And then up here we have some acorns. These just happen to be white oak acorns. Each of these acorns from the 20 different species all look a little bit different. And once you start getting clued into what those differences are, it can make the identification of those trees easy just from the acorns. Some of the caps on these acorns will extend way down. Some will have fringy little hairs on them. Some will be really small. Sometimes the acorns are larger than others. So again, each of those is just a little unique characteristic that we can use to tell one tree from another. Talk about tree location as well. This is one that, again, you may not think about all the time, but it can be quite valuable. So another image here of Robinson Forest in eastern Kentucky, and we know which species natively occur there generally. So there would be certain species that we wouldn't expect to see there very often just because we know they don't grow there. And these trees will grow, you left to their own devices, where they can successfully compete. Now, I think any tree, for the most part, would grow in great soil with full sunlight and ample water and great nutrients and be really happy. But what separates where one tree grows from another is where it successfully competes. So some trees are able to compete on much poorer sites. For instance, our oaks can grow on poorer sites than some of the other species. They can grow better on some of the poorer sites than trees like the yellow poplar, which is a little more demanding on some of its where it grows. So that can give us a clue. Now, some of these may grow well in bottomlands. They may be able to tolerate where the soil stay wet for an extended period, such as the bald cypress or the pin oak. I know pin oak's a tree that's commonly planted in yards and city landscapes. Part of that reason is because it can take those compacted soils that are there as well. And again, other trees may grow in uplands. So again, knowing where some of these trees can grow can give you a good clue to where they'll be. So we don't want to overlook that as a thing. But again, kind of a warning about all of that is, it does not apply to planted trees. So we can basically, as people, we can move trees wherever, we can plant them wherever, and unfortunately sometimes we bring trees from other countries or other areas, and they get planted here, and they can be successful, and hopefully they won't be problematic. But again, the identification and the location especially does not apply to planted trees. So let's talk for a few minutes about the different types of leaves we see on trees. Now, believe it or not, pine trees and those that have needles, those are really a type of leaf. It's just a different type of a leaf than we kind of think of often. On the far left here, we have the bald cypress. This is a relatively unique species in terms of number of relatives that it has. There's not many of this group of cypresses that we have, and this is the only one that we have here in Kentucky. This is a tree that we'll often find in very wet areas out in western Kentucky and some of those swamps out there. We'll see it quite commonly. It's a beautiful tree, and it's kind of very distinctive. It looks similar really to the Dawn redwood and some of those trees out in California that can get quite large. But the trees that we have most here in Kentucky are these broadleaf species. Here we have the shellbark hickory. This is a tree that has beautiful hickory nuts and also really important habitat for bats. It's got really shaggy defoliating bark on it. Over here is another one of our oak species. This happens to be the bur oak species. This is common a lot in the bluegrass region. If you've been around any of the horse farms here in central Kentucky, this is one of the trees that's commonly one of the larger trees that you'll see out in the fields there. So the differences that we're going to talk about though are leaves that are needles or leaves that are broadleaf, and we'll go first probably on the ones that are conifers or needles, and then we'll spend most of our time tonight talking about the broadleaves. But again, I should warn you really quick. And this can be a little frustrating for folks that are just learning their tree identification. All leaves of the same species and even the same exact tree are not exactly the same. We see a lot of variability amongst our leaves. Some trees are quite known for that variability amongst their leaves. So for example, here we have a black oak leaf. And then right here we have another black oak leaf, and there you can see quite a bit of difference in those leaves. And again, it's the same exact species, it's just inherent variability. Just like in people, we have people of different sizes and shapes. Trees that are the same species can have quite a bit of variability. So the thing that we will always try to work on is we'll try to find an average leaf when we're making our identification process. So here's another one. This is a black oak leaf, and really what you're seeing here is variation. A lot of times this variation is associated with how much sunlight that individual leaf is getting. So we would consider this one over here on the left. This would be more of a shade leaf. That means it's in a position where it's not getting a lot of shade. So the strategy for that individual leaf is to put out as much leaf area as absolutely possible. And then we get one here in the middle with that's not quite as bad. And then this would be probably a higher up leaf. It's kind of shiny. It's getting all the sunlight it needs, and it's probably a little bit later in the season as well. So again, I just want to draw your attention that there can be some challenges when we're looking at leaves. So when you go to identify a tree using its leaves, it's absolutely critical that you find that average leaf. And that average leaf, it can be a challenge sometimes to find, but just don't grab the very first leaf you see off of that tree, because it may be atypical and it may cause you a lot of frustration when you're trying to go through the ID process. So let's spend a few minutes talking about our conifers. These are what we call our cone-bearing trees here in Kentucky. And really, we've only got 9 different species that natively occur here. Certainly, there's others that have been planted here in Kentucky, and there's others that can survive and be successful here. We have the eastern red cedar, quite common here in the central part of the state. One that's a little more rare is the arborvitae, or northern white cedar. We also have the eastern hemlock, which we're showing there in the picture, bald cypress I mentioned before, eastern white pine, pitch pine, shortleaf pine, Virginia pine, and loblolly pine. Now, loblolly pine is not natively occurring here, but it has been planted extensively, certainly in western Kentucky and some other areas. And you also see patches of the eastern white pine that were planted long ago, back when the SCS, or the former NRCS offices out there, were really promoting those white pines. So there are patches of these little white pine blocks across the state, and in western Kentucky we will see the loblolly pine. And the way we go about trying to identify these different pine trees is based on their needle arrangement, and we're going to go over each one of these real quick, but I just want to point out how these different arrangements occur, and we'll talk about each of these as we go on. But so here on the left of this little diagram we have scale-like, and this will be some of our cedars that have this kind of scale-like leaves. Again, these are needles, which is a type of a leaf. Some of them have just a single needle, and we'll talk about the one that has that. And then most of them have their needles in bundles, and these bundles are going to be an important clue. The number of individual needles in each of these bundles is a clue to which species we're dealing with. So these are kind of some of these characteristics that we can use. And again, it works just as well for the conifers, or our softwoods, if you will, that as it does for our broadleaf trees. So we'll talk about each one of those as we go on here. So let's start with our conifers with flattened needles. The first one I want to spend a moment on is the eastern red cedar. And as soon as I say something like flattened needles, they're not all flattened, because some of the juvenile needles of the eastern red cedar are kind of spiky. Like if you'll notice these in the upper left corner, these are a little spiky. It's the same tree, it just happens to be those are little immature needles, and they're spiky at this point, and over time they will kind of get that scale-like pattern. So that's what we're trying to see in here, is this kind of scale-like pattern in the upper top. So that's one that has kind of the scales. Another one is the northern white cedar. Again, this is a little rarer, and you do see it planted quite often in landscape settings, but to see it natively occurring is a little bit rarer. But it really has that classic scale-like appearance that we can see here throughout. And then another one that's really these are kind of flattened, and they're really a needle, but I put them in here because I thought they were most similar to these other species. This is the bald cypress. Again, a very fine, feathery branch tree. And then one unique thing about the bald cypress is it will drop its needles, all of its needles, in the winter. So unlike our other conifers that we're going to talk about who maintain their needles throughout the year, the bald cypress will actually drop them all. So that's another kind of little characteristic that we can use to identify one tree from another. So next, let's talk about those with bundled needles. The first one is eastern hemlock, and I suppose you could argue that one needle does not make a bundle, but just go along with me on this. We're talking about just a single needle attached to the twig. So this is the eastern hemlock. It's an easy one to identify. It has these nice little shiny silvery stripes underneath its bark, underneath the bottom side of the leaves. And unfortunately, this is a species that's being attacked by the hemlock woolly adelgid as well. Next, we'll mention the shortleaf pine. The shortleaf pine has 2 or 3 needles, and again, we would find these little bundles here where we're looking at how they attach to the twig. So if you see a tree that has bundles in 2 and 3, then we know we're dealing with a shortleaf pine if it's natively occurring here in Kentucky. And then the other one that is quite common in throughout the state, but certainly a lot more so in eastern Kentucky, is the Virginia pine. It has short twisted needles of 2, so we've got 2 little needles there, and it will have cones that will persist through the year. So again, these are all just little characteristics that we can use to tell one of these trees from another. So let's talk next about those with a few more needles in their bundles. This is the pitch pine. And the pitch pine, because since we do have some that have 3 needles in it, it has a little smaller needle compared to the next ones we're going to see here. The loblolly pine, this is the one I talked about before. We say it's commonly planted in western Kentucky. This will have needles that are 6 to 10 inches long. So if we have a tree, a conifer with needles and bundles of 3, then we can use the length of those needles to distinguish one from another. And then one that would probably most common to many of us, or what we think about when we think about pine trees, is the eastern white pine. And it has bundles with needles of 5 in it. So if you pull off a bundle from a tree, a little twig there, and you see 5 needles in it, then you know you have a white pine. So let's get into the broadleaf key characteristics. One of the most important ones we will use is the leaf arrangement. And what we mean there is how the leaves are attached to the twig, and we'll spend more time talking about that. The form of the leaf, whether it's a simple leaf or a compound leaf. The leaf margin, and when we talk about the margin of the leaf, we're talking about basically this outside part of it. And there's characteristics that we will look for on the leaf to help us tell what it is. Again, that's our good friend the yellow poplar there. Even look at this one, though. It's quite variable from the one we saw earlier. So there can be variability amongst many of our species. Next, we'll talk about the tips of the leaves, the actual ends or the apexes. This is that part here. There are some unique characteristics about those. And we'll briefly talk about the leaf base as well, how that attaches to the little petiole there, this little stem that attaches it to the twig. So all of those are little areas that we can use. But we will spend most of our time talking about leaf arrangement, leaf form, and leaf margin. And with those 3 things, we're able to identify most trees. We sometimes do have to rely on our leaf tips and leaf base. So let's talk about leaf arrangement for a moment. What we have here is the opposite arrangement. And what I'm saying is that these buds, or the leaves, are arranged opposite from one another. So we have one leaf and bud right there, and then we have one leaf and bud right there, and these are what we call opposite. And there's a nice little mnemonic that you can use to remember which trees have opposite branching, and I'll be talking about that a lot. How are they branched? So the opposite branching refers to mad buck, and that mad just stands for maple, ash, and dogwood, and the buck stands for buckeyes. So if we have a tree that is opposite branched, or where the leaves are opposite of one another, then if it's a native tree here in Kentucky, we know it is one of these species. It's either a maple, it's either an ash, a dogwood, or a buckeye. So that there in itself is a great clue to what species we're dealing with, because that can help us narrow it down quite quickly. Next, I want to talk about alternate branching, and just as it implies, that means the leaves are opposite or alternate of one another. So we have one coming off here, and then down here, alternating is another one. So pay attention to that, because it's really important. This is an important distinction that we use to separate one leaf and one tree eventually from another. And I put the little asterisk on here because when you're dealing with biological things, there's always exceptions. While most of the remaining species are in there, there is one species that has whorled branching. That's where we have 3 leaves coming off at the same spot. So if we were dealing with the northern catalpa, we would expect to see another leaf coming off here, and they call that a whorled pattern. So most of our species are going to be in this alternate category, but one of the first things we'll look at is that opposite or alternate, and we'll practice that here in a few minutes. So that brings us to the importance of the bud, and again, these are the buds we're talking about here. These are the terminal buds, or excuse me, the lateral buds that we use primarily to distinguish it, and hopefully you can tell right now that this little twig right here has alternate branching. So we tell it's alternate by looking at here and here. And then if we contrast that over to here, we see that this tree, which is a little maple, has opposite branching. So you see there's one there and then one there. So that's an important clue to what we're dealing with. Now these buds are really important. The next year's growth, whether it's the stems or the fruits or the leaves of the tree, so they play a very important role. And it's an undeveloped thing, and these will occur either at the end or the very tip of the thing where we're talking about the terminal buds, or they'll occur in the axil of the leaf, like we see here, right there where the axil, where the leaf connects to the tree itself. So locating that lateral bud, and that's these here on the side, is absolutely critical to tree identification. And it's critical because of what we just talked about a moment ago, to be able to separate whether these are alternate trees or opposite trees. So again, we'll practice some more on that, but keep that in mind. That's an important attribute that we use. So let's just take a look at some of these different buds that we have here. Just pulling up a few of these different pictures, and we'll point them out. So this up here is a pawpaw tree, and it has a small little kind of covered up lateral bud. Over here we have a maple, little opposite branching, and we can see those there. In the center, really conspicuous big old buds. These are the beech tree, the American beech tree. Sometimes they're referred to as the cigar buds. Over here, this is the yellow poplar. It has some buds are a little larger than others there. The terminal bud is kind of has like a duck bill. If you see that out in the tree, that's a good out in the woods when you're looking at smaller little trees. That's a common one you'll see. But what we're looking for are these little lateral buds on the side. Down here we have buckeye, and again this is a tree that has opposite branching, and you can see that these has the buds right there in the axil of the leaves opposite one another. And then over here we have alternate branching on this one right here. So these buds are rather small. Now these buds are important because they tell us where the leaf starts, and that's important when we're talking about the difference between simple leaves like this right here, or a compound leaf that has leaflets. So we have leaves that are just one single leaf. If you think about our oaks and maples, those are simple leaves. Our beech tree is a simple leaf. Things like the buckeye or a horse chestnut, they are called palmately. If you think about all the leaflets come basically from a palm shape, from the palm of your hand, if you can imagine like your fingers. And then we have this pinnately compound, meaning that the leaflets, and these are leaflets, this whole thing here is a leaf, but each individual one of these is a leaflet. So this is a pinnately compound leaf. And then over here we have what we call a doubly compound leaf. So this whole thing is a leaf. So we start looking at trees kind of like the Kentucky coffee tree here. This leaf right here is more like some of our ash, some of our hickories that have, and walnut as well, that have that compound leaf. Now, I'll tell you, sometimes people will bring in one of these leaflets and they'll ask me to identify it, and it's sometimes I can, but most of the time I cannot. You need the entire leaf. So if you're going to ask somebody to help you identify a leaf, make sure that you're dealing with the whole leaf and not just an individual leaflet. The other thing we look a lot at is the margins of the leaf. Here we're talking about the edge of the leaf, so this means it's entire, it's intact, and you have some different ones, different kind of categories that you may see in different keys. Serrate, if you think about like a knife, a serrated knife, that's a good way to remember that. Sometimes that serration is real fine, sometimes it's more coarse, other times it's uneven, or what we call doubly serrate, and that'll be a clue. It may ask you, is the tree doubly serrate, or is it finely serrate? Crenate, kind of a little more wavy like that, and lobed. So these are lobes right here. Many of our oaks are lobed, and the space in between are the sinuses. So it'll ask you about the lobing. So this is the lobing. So when we talk about the leaf margins, we're talking about the edges of those, and that also applies to the leaflet margins as well. So the leaf tips. Again, won't spend much time on this, but I do want to just point out that there are differences at the tips, and sometimes a key will ask you, what does the leaf tip look like? So that's just what they're talking about, these different shapes. And there's a variety of them. This truncate here, this is the yellow poplar that we have, and this is one of our oaks down here, this bristle tip. And a good way to tell a red oak from a white oak is the red oaks will have these bristle tips on their leaves, and the white oaks will not. They'll be more rounded. And then this one right here is a rather unique tree. It's kind of a living fossil. This is the ginkgo leaf. It's the only one of its kind in the world, and you may see some of those planted in landscapes, but that's its type of leaf tip. And the other thing are the bases, and really what we're talking about is this area down here, how it connects to this little petiole. Sometimes it'll be quite distinctive, like in this cordate shape. Other times not so much. Sometimes it's uneven, and that can be a clue. Again, each one of these little things that I've been talking about provide us a clue as to what tree we're identifying. So pay attention to these because they will be quite useful as we go. But throughout the process, we're going to look at really 4 key questions. The first one that we'll always ask, does it have leaves or needles? Because at that point, we can start narrowing down what we're dealing with. The next question we'll often ask, is it alternate or is it opposite? Then we'll ask, is the leaf a simple leaf or is it a compound leaf? And then the next thing we'll often look at is the leaf margin or the leaflet margin. Asking these 4 key questions and working through a key can allow us to identify almost any tree. So real quick for review before we get some tests out there for you. The alternate branching, we're talking right here. Again, these buds are alternate of one another, and if we had a little leaf, it would be coming off here and it would be coming off there. They are alternate of one another as compared to the opposite branching we have here. And that's where the leaves come across opposite one another. And you'll notice if you look on maple trees and ash trees that this opposite also occurs to their branching overall. So you can see it in their branches as well. But this is an important characteristic that we'll look for. Next is the leaf form. And again, to identify where the leaf starts, we're looking for the bud. So we found the bud right here. We found a bud right there. So that tells us that this whole thing here, everything beyond this little bud is leaf. And in this case, we're dealing with a simple leaf. I think that might be a persimmon there. So here looking at a compound leaf. Look here, you see those buds again. Sometimes they're more available than others, but you just have to look. So that tells us that that's a leaf coming. Everything beyond that is leaf, and then right here, everything, all of this is leaf. So this is the whole leaf here we're talking about, one compound leaf, and each one of these individual parts of that leaf are called a leaflet. So that's an important distinction as well. So let's show you some leaf margins. Again, the margins, we're talking about the edges of the leaf here on the edge. These are entire. That means they are not broken up. There's no, no broken up parts of it. It's not serrated. It's a smooth, entire edge. And then here we look at some examples of some serrated edges. Notice the edges here, they're kind of got the little tooth shape on them. So again, these are going to be clues that we can use to identify one tree from another. And then next is the lobing. And here we have a red oak up here, and it'll have these are lobes here, and it has little bristle tips. Maybe a little hard to see in this picture, but they're there. And then here is a white oak also with lobes, but more with the rounded tips as well. So let's quiz you. I'm going to pause for a second on each of these to give you all a chance. I would encourage you to scream it out as loud as you feel comfortable. If you're in extension office, have a little fun with it, and then we'll work through what each of these answers are. So my first one should be an easy one for you. Is this a conifer or a broadleaf? And hopefully everybody answered that we're dealing with a conifer here, and we tell it's a conifer by these needles. All right, how about here? Are we dealing with an opposite or an alternate branched tree? Which one? Ah, excellent, thank you. Yeah, so we're looking at opposite branching there. What about this one? Simple or compound? Give you a little clue. Right down there in the red circle is the bud. So we're dealing with a compound leaf. Alternate or opposite here. So again, what are we looking for? We're looking for the buds, and that tells us where the leaf starts. So in this one, we've got another alternate. The margins, are these serrated or are they lobed? And again, when we talk about the margins, we're looking at the edges. So this is a common one, serrated, excellent. What's the arrangement of this? Is it opposite or is it alternate? Again, what are we looking for? We're looking for the little buds, and that tells us the arrangement. Excellent. Opposite one another. You all are doing great. All right, now here's a little more. Think about this for a second. Is this statement true or false? This leaf is lobed, serrated, and compound. I will tell you that right here is the bud. Yes, this is a false statement because it's actually opposite all of those. It is an entire leaf. It is unlobed, and it is simple. So this is a opposite or false of all of those. All right, what are the margins on this? Are we entire or are we serrated? Maybe a little difficult for you to tell, but I'll help you out. It is entire. That is a beautiful little tree, the eastern red bud. All right, so here we go. Which of these does not belong in this sequence? Give you a second to look at each of them. One of them is different from the others on the leaf margin. Yes, C. C has an entire margin, and the others are all serrated. So again, you all are starting to see these characteristics that we look for, and these books or the book I'm going to walk you through here in a second will ask you some of these characteristics as well, and most tree ID keys will do the same. Okay, we're getting close to wrapping up the quizzes. From what you can see on this one, are they simple or compound? So we see a little bud right there. Might be a little hard to tell, but hopefully you can guess. Yes, these are simple leaves. Is it opposite or alternate? So again, we look for the bud location. So there's the bud right there. Yep, these are alternate. Now what about the leaf margin? What do we look there? It's entire or serrated. So this is an entire margin. Excellent. So what's the form of this leaf here? So again, here's the little bud. We're talking about simple or compound. These are simple. What's the margin? Margins are serrated, if you can see here. And the arrangement. The arrangement, again, looking at where the buds are, the alternate. So these are all clues. This happens to be American chestnut that's planted in Oldham County. Some of you all may have seen these leaves before. All right, so talking about how we go about this process, we call it a dichotomous key, and it's basically just making a choice between, you'll be presented some options, and when you get those options, you read both the options and you make a choice that best fits. And hopefully, if everything goes well, you'll get to the actual tree of interest. So again, just two choices at a time. Make sure you read them both and understand them, and we're going to go through some examples right now. This first one here is an example that I'll show you. This is one we just made up. This is how it would work. So your first question will be presented with, does it have needles or leaves? And you'll make an answer, and you're going to say, I think it has leaves, hopefully. And then it'll say, go to B. And then it'll give us two more options. Notice that if it was a needles, it would have told us it's probably a conifer, and they would have been right. But we're going to go to B, and then we'll say, are the leaves simple or are the leaves compound? And we'll make our decision there, and we know that those are simple leaves. And then we'll look at the branching, and we'll know that it is alternate. So then we'll go down to F down here. So getting through that little key, we were able to get down that this is a serviceberry. And again, there's a Latin for that, Amelanchier canadensis. So that is the way a key works. It's real simple process, and we're going to, I got a few examples that we're going to run through here so you can get a feel for this and spend some time with it. Hopefully if you are at a county extension office, you should have some of these packets. If you don't, as far as having a printout of that, you should be fine because you'll be able to see it on the screen. So the one that we're going to use is this one here. It's the Tree Finder. You can get this thing for $3 to $5 at Walmart or Amazon. It's a handy little tool that covers most, not all, but most of the trees here in Kentucky. And we use it a lot because it's rather simple and it's easy to follow along with. So I'm really thankful for letting us use this. to try to teach this process to you. All right, so let's start with this one right here. So you've been presented with this, and I know we saw it before, but we're just going to read through. So we always start at the top, and it's going to ask us if the tree has needles, start with this symbol, and if the tree has leaves, we start with this symbol. So probably the biggest challenge you'll have using this is remembering what your little symbol is. So on this one, we remember here that this is the symbol we want to look for. So and it's on this page, so we'll come down to here. And if the needles are long, 1/2 to 18 inches, go below. And if the needles are short, scale-like, or overlapping, go on to page 13. Hopefully we can all agree. I've put the little ruler there for you. These are longer than 1/2 inch and less than 18. So we're going to go below to this symbol right here. That brings us to this point right here. And then it's going to ask us, are the needles in bundles or tufts, or are they just a single needle? I think we'd all agree that there are 3 needles in this. So we're going to go below to this symbol right here. And that brings us to this. And it says, are the needles in bundles of 2 to 5? Or if the needles are deciduous, or many in a tuft. So I think we would all agree that there's 3, which qualifies 2 to 5. So that tells us that it's in the pines, and it tells us to go on to page 6. So that should be the next page in your handout. And we come down to our pines. And again, that's the challenge you'll run into a lot, is remembering your little symbol that you're trying to find on the next page. So it'll ask us if there are 5 needles in a bundle, or if there are 2 to 3 needles in a bundle. I think we'd all agree that it's 3, as we can see here. So we're going to go on to the next page, and we're going to look for that symbol there, which is up here at the top. If there are 2 needles in a bundle, no. If there are 3 needles in a bundle, yes. So we'll go below, again, looking for that symbol there, which happens to be here. And I'll read this bottom one. If the needles are 5 or more inches long, no. If the needles are less than 5 inches long, y'all agreeing, twisted, and there's some other clues there. But what we're dealing with here is a pitch pine. So that is the process of using this dichotomous key. We just walk through those 2 questions at a time. We try to read each one of them until we get to the species we're with, that we know we've got. Again, you want to make sure you're looking at a representative sample. If you would have picked this, just one needle off of there and tried to work through this key, you would have been frustrated. Or if you would have picked one of these tufts that only had 2 in it, you would have been frustrated. So again, making sure you've got a really representative sample off of that tree is absolutely critical for you to have success. And sometimes you will mess up and you just got to start again. But hopefully it's a fun learning process that you'll enjoy, and it won't get you too frustrated. All right, so let's do another one. All right, so let's ID this tree right here. So we've got here again, needles or leaves. I think we'll agree on this one. We're talking about leaves. So we're going to go to page 14. We're going to look for that little lollipop shape there. And that's right up here. And I pulled you up another picture of the same species just to help in the ID, because it's asking about the arrangement. Are they opposite or are they alternate? I think we'll all agree that this has opposite needles, right? Or excuse me, opposite buds or leaves here. So we will go below to this symbol here that represents opposite, and that's got us right here. And now, are the leaves compound, composed of several leaflets, or is it simple? And as you recall, that was a compound leaf. It was palmately compound. So we're going to go below to this symbol here. And that gets us down here. If the 5 or more leaflets radiate from one point, or if the leaflets do not radiate from one point. And again, we had that palmately, so they radiated from one point. So that we're going to go to the next, go on to page 15 and look for that symbol there. This should be right up here. And now it's asking if there are usually 5 leaflets, and each leaflet has a short stalk. We don't have the winter buds to see right now, but we can see here there's a really short stalk on each of these leaflets, and there is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 leaflets. So we feel pretty good that we can go on down to the buckeyes down here, and now we just have to tell the difference between whether it's a yellow buckeye or an Ohio buckeye, both of which are native in Kentucky. But we're going to look here, if the leaflets are irregularly and bluntly toothed, which you see right along this margin here, there's some irregularities, or if the leaflets are regularly and finely toothed. So what we've got here is the Ohio Buckeye, and we're using that irregularity to distinguish them. And if you had an actual Buckeye in your hand or you had the foliage, another clue is that it will stink. It'll have a disagreeable odor. So, and that's another clue there. So use all the pieces that you can in each one of those and to get the ID. All right, let's do another one. Now, we talked about what this one was already, but let's work our way through it to see if we can continue the process. So again, we always start at the top, needles or leaves. I think we'll all agree that we have leaves here, so we're going to go on to page 14. And we're back here at this symbol. And then you're just going to have to take my word for it that this is alternate, that this leaf grows alternate. And so that's going to send us on to page 21, and we're going to, and we're looking for this symbol right here that shows the alternate branching. And I brought you up a little picture of the bud there. So a little opposite or alternate branching there. It's alternate one another. They are not directly across. All right. So if the leaves are compound or if the leaves are simple, so I think we'll all agree that that's a simple leaf. And if you can't agree with me too much, just take my word for it because it is. This is a simple leaf. So we're going to go on to page 28 and looking for that symbol. And that symbol is here. And it's asking if the leaf has neither teeth nor lobes, or if the leaf has teeth of any kind, or wavy margins, or lobes. Again, remember, these are the lobes that we talked about. So this tree has multiple lobes. So we're going to go on to page 33 to get that. And we pick that symbol up here on page 33. If the leaf is evergreen and tipped with stiff, sharp spines, or if the leaf is not evergreen. So this is not an evergreen leaf. The one that would probably be a holly if it did have those sharp tipped spines, but this does not. So we're going to go on to the next page, and we're looking for that symbol. So we'll turn the page, and that brings us to this symbol up here. So now if the tree has thorns or thorn-like twigs, or if the tree has no thorns or thorn-like twigs, this tree has no thorns on it. So we're going to go below down to this symbol here, which is right here. If the margin is toothed or doubly toothed continuously along or almost all of its margin, or if the leaf is either deeply or shallowly lobed or waved. So this is not sawtooth. It is kind of deeply lobed. So that's the option that we're going to go here. So we're going to go on to page 51, and we're going to look for that symbol. And that brings us to this symbol here on this page. If the margin has waves hardly indented or deeply enough to be called lobes, or if the leaf is lobed. I think we would all agree that this is lobes. So we've got multiple lobes here. So if it's lobed, we're going to go on to page 53 and look for that symbol. And that symbol brings us down here. If the leaf has only 2 or 3 or 4 lobes, or if it has more than 4 lobes. So we're going to look here. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So it's got more than 4 lobes. So we're going to go on to page 55. We're going to look for that symbol. And here's that symbol. If the lobes are bristle pointed or if they are rounded, and this one they are rounded. So we're going to go on to page 58 and look for that symbol. And here that is. If the leaf is small, 2 to 4 inches and ear-like lobes, or if the leaf is not thus. This one right here is an English oak, the one it's talking about, and that one's this down here. In this little book, they've got the little ship there to indicate that it's not from around here. So if we know we're dealing with the native species, we know we wouldn't be dealing with that. Now, if you were in a yard or a landscape, that may be another story. So we know it's not that. We're going to go below to this symbol right here. If the lobes are square cut with the 3 end lobes much larger than the others, it's a post oak, which is this right here. We know it's not that, so we're going to go to this. If the lobes are not that, then we're going to go below to this symbol, and that's going to bring us to right here. And if these lobes are somewhat similar in size and shape, which I think we could largely agree that they are, then we're dealing with a white oak. But again, it's important to read the other. If the middle of the leaf is cut nearly to the midrib on most of the leaf, and the upper half of the leaf is not deeply lobed. So this right here is that bur oak, and then here is the white oak. So we just went through this process and we've identified the white oak just by this stepwise process. All right, and I've got one more that I want to try to work through real quickly. This is another tree that's quite common here in Kentucky. It has different kinds of buds on it, and we'll work through this. But if you don't have leaves, I just wanted to show you that we can still use this dichotomous key approach to identify the different trees. So let's start with that. This is the same author and her husband put this one out, Winter Tree Finder. This is a great book as far as working with trees in the winter when we don't have the leaves. Again, just a couple of dollars. Not a bad investment if you're interested in it. So let's start. Again, we always start where they tell us if the tree is a conifer and needle bearing, and if the tree is not a conifer. So I'll tell you, if you're not for sure, this is not a conifer. So we are going to go to this symbol on the next page. And that brings us to here. So then if the leaf scars are alternate, one leaf scar is a opposite of the other, basically. So again, we're getting at that opposite, or I mean alternate or opposite branching. And down here, you can see it's maybe a little challenging for you, but this has opposite branching. And if you can't really tell that, I'm sorry, but just take my word for it. This does have opposite branching. And so we're going to go below to that symbol right here, and then it's going to ask us again, do we have multiple leaf scars in that whorled fashion, the hardy catawba, or if the leaf scars are not whorled but come in pairs, each opposite of one another. And again, there's one on this side and then one just on the other side as well there. So it is opposite of one another. So we're going to go to page 44 looking for this symbol up here. If the entire twig is a 1/4 inch or more thick and the terminal bud is oval and conspicuous, go there. Or if the entire twig is not 1/4 inch or more thick, or does not have an oval conspicuous end bud. So this one, this is the one that applies. This is a small, really thin little twig, so it's less than a 1/4 inch thick. So we're going to go below to this symbol here. That brings us to here. If the terminal buds are rough and dry and the bundle scars form an almost continuous line on the shield-shaped or oval leaf scar, it is an ash. Or if the terminal buds are not rough and dry and the leaf scars are narrow, inconspicuous with 3 bundle scars. And if you were to break out your magnifying glass, you would see that right there are 3 little bundle scars where the leaf attaches to the twig. So that brings us to this one here below. So we're right here now. So I'll read the bottom one since I know it's not that. If the leaf scars are somewhat V-shaped and those are not, then we know we're dealing with the maple, but what we've got up here is actually the flowering dogwood. If there is a notched line encircling the twig connecting each pair of leaf scars, and if the tree has 2 kinds of buds, so these are its flower buds and these are the vegetative buds on it. So again, it can be a little more challenging when you're dealing with twigs, but it is possible to identify the species. So many of y'all probably recognize this as flowering dogwood, and that is what it is. Talk briefly about some of the ID resources. One of the common questions that I always get is about mobile apps, and there's certainly a lot of mobile apps out there, and you may have found some that you really like, and that's great. I will tell you, I would encourage you to read the reviews on those. A number of those apps out there, I've heard bad things or read bad reviews on them. Personally, I don't use them, but I would just encourage you, if you're going to pay for one, I would check out the reviews on it before I made that purchase. Here's a few little websites that you might want to check out. Almost every one of the images I used came from Forestry Images. They've got almost any species. You just type it in and it'll bring up the leaves for that species. Another great one is plants, USDA.gov. It's got about all of them. Here's a nice one out of Ohio Public Library, actually. It's a nice little key that you can walk through. The Arbor Day is another good one that we can use occasionally, and there's a link for that. And then here's one out of Wisconsin, Stevens Point. It's a nice another one to use. This webinar will be available. You can come back and copy these links out of the page, hopefully, or they're available in that handout in the upper left-hand corner as well. So we talked about the tree finder, the one we use there. It's a great one. Encourage you to check it out. The winter tree finder. There's another one. We also have one that we sell here out of the Department of Forestry for only $2. It's a real bargain, and it comes with a little key as well. So that's something that might be available for you. And then if you're really a big tree enthusiast and you really want to know all about the trees and what they're good for, where they grow, and all that type stuff, this is one of my personal favorites, North American Trees by Preston and Braun. So that's a good reference if you really want to know why. But I will tell you, you can find just on the internet really all of this information. It's not required that you purchase anything. Just if you do purchase, make sure you know what you're getting. I don't want you to be dissatisfied with your purchase. So I'm going to wrap this up real quick and go over some summary things. Please, look for those unique characteristics. And hopefully through tonight's webinar, you have been able to kind of tune your eyes to see and how they are unique, and they really are, and that's what makes it so much fun and exciting. This is another thing that I can't tell you enough. Please make sure you look at more than one leaf when you're trying to pick one to ID. You want to try to get one that looks average for the overall tree. Otherwise, you might end up with some frustration when you're trying to identify it. And there's really no substitute to going out in the woods with somebody that knows their trees and spending a little time with them and having them point out some of them. I will tell you that we do tree ID workshops throughout the year, typically with our Woodland Owner Short course, and we do that in a more hands-on way than we can do in this format, so that may be something you want to check with. I know many of the county extension offices will also offer tree ID workshops, and we'd be happy to work with you if there's enough need out there as well. I will say the best thing you can do is practice. Just practice using these tree ID keys. The tools I gave you right here are a great introduction to what those are. There are some available that you can download on the internet as well. And be patient. This should be a lot of fun. One of the great things about Kentucky is our diversity of tree species, and there's a ton of them out there. And getting to know and understand those trees and where you can find them is just a blast, at least for me. And if you have any questions after tonight, if you are at a county extension office, feel free to let them know if you've got questions. And if they don't know the answer, they know where they can get some resources. If you're at home, you certainly, I'd still encourage you to reach out to your county extension office and your agents there. They're a tremendous resource, not only on forestry-related questions, but a wide variety of other things. And otherwise, I'll take any questions that you all might have right now. And you always will have the ability to get a hold of us via email or phone if you've got questions later. But if there's a tree that you're wanting to get ID'd and you can't get it ID'd locally, send those pictures or take the sample to your county extension agent, and they know how to get them to us. And really can't thank you all enough for being with us tonight, and I'll stick around if there are any questions. Again, thanks to Renee for running things behind the scene, and make sure that you download those files up in the upper left-hand corner. There is the webinar handout, which is this presentation. I also have in there the Kentucky State Nature Preserve Commission's list of native trees. So they've got all the trees there, both their common name and their Latin. So that's a great resource that you can use. And please, by all means, use that evaluation, complete that evaluation so that we can know how we were doing, so we can do a better job in the future. And I'll let you type in any questions that you might have. And again, thank you all so much. Agents, we really appreciate you all opening up your offices and hosting folks. Thank you so much.